Robin, thank you for joining us. Glad to have you in the show.
My pleasure.
So my first question is going to be like, is anything specific or a specific moment that sparked your like need for studying like human behavior or emotions, or was there any moment where you said like specific moment where you said I need to understand this better, let's say?
I'm not sure about understanding better because every day, and I suppose this is true of science in general, every day you discover something and then you kind of think, I need to understand that better than I do already. So it's always progressive. But I suppose my interest in human behavior really goes back to the fact that I grew up in East Africa. There you are very immersed in many different cultures from all over the world, including Spanish people who turned up out of the blue out there. I was at school with a Spanish boy. So, and I guess also my grandmother lived in California. She was very interested in science in general and so on, and was very keen on Spanish. Tried to get me to learn Spanish as a child for when I visited her. But if you kind of live in that kind of multicultural environment, you kind of absorb this complexity and you kind of go, oh, this is interesting. Even if you don't kind of sit there and think at the time, I wonder why different cultures are different and so on. But I think looking back on it, it's clear that kind of, if I'd grown up in one kind of European country, let's say, at that time, I certainly wouldn't have had those experiences, and I certainly wouldn't have been, I'm sure, so attuned to seeing differences between cultures that kind of made you ask the question, well, I wonder why these guys do it this way and we do it a different way.
Sure. Do you how about the Spanish? Did you end up learning actual Spanish or not?
Oh, no, I got as far as como está usted.
Okay, you got far away. Yeah,
That's
that's
about it.
great.
Yeah.
No, because we're from Argentina. That's why I'm asking.
All right. Yes. The home
Um,
of good Spanish.
exactly.
I tell you a funny joke. A friend of, a group of mathematicians I collaborate in Finland had a Mexican student visiting them, and he decided he would go to Spain, and then he went on a visit there, and then when he came back, he said, I'm going to have to go back there and teach them how to speak Spanish properly, the South American way.
Right? That's how it is. It is that way. Actually, lots of people actually love like our South American kind of Spanish, like in comparison with other. They find it like a bit like more musical maybe.
Uh-huh, that's
And
interesting.
yes, because I know it's insane, but usually they find some music in it. We actually don't. Like it's so innate for us that we don't actually detect it.
Right.
And that's great. Getting into the yeah,
So,
pick off.
I was going to say, I guess, if you, and also because I lived in Africa, you're surrounded by animals. And so you're seeing animal behavior all the time. And I guess these are the two groundings from which all my research then later developed. So all the animal side from being exposed to animals, all the stuff I did more recently on human behavior then came from seeing this variety of human behavior, and because I speak Swahili is my second language. I grew up speaking Swahili and English at the same time, and my
Is
father came
Swahili
from
hard?
India. He spoke Hindi and English at the same time, so you're kind of very familiar with these other cultures from the inside, let's say.
Yeah, I can imagine. Is Swahili a hard language to learn?
It is if you want to speak proper Swahili, but there's a kind of, I don't know what you would call it. It's called kitchen Swahili in Africa, which is a very simplified version, which is used right the way all over Africa, East Africa, into the Congo, Central Africa even, whereas proper Swahili is only spoken on the coast. That's where originally it came from.
Okay.
Swahili is a trading language like English is. English is a mixture of English and French and Scandinavian, old
Okay.
Scandinavian, Norse, with other bits and pieces thrown in. And that was because, the Vikings were here trading rather than pillaging, and so you have these sort of half and half language grows up. I guess this may be even true in some parts of South America. You get sort of mixtures of, on the edge of city society, you get sort of in the countryside, you get half Spanish, half Native American languages and things. So this is Swahili is very much like that, but it has a very long. It's half Arabic, half Bantu language, but it has a very long history and has a written history going back to the 1700s, writing poetry in the Arabic style form.
Okay, we might call you again to I don't know if you've written anything about like language or that stuff, but I've been going deep into it lately. But maybe we can talk it another time.
Okay, I
For
could talk about language forever.
Okay, that's great to know. My main question I wanted to start with regarding love and mainly love. Let's see if we get to betrayal later. Like we usually tend to label and to treat love as an emotion, like a specific emotion, and I feel like it's more like a cluster of emotions, both positive and negative. And I don't know what's that about? What's going on there? Is it?
I think it's true, actually, that the emotions that we experience in love are so complicated that it's difficult to get your mind around them, to understand them rationally. That's fine. You don't have to understand it. Just go with it. If you stop and think about these kinds of behaviors and emotional states, then usually you end up messing it up badly. Right, you get it wrong. The whole point about the emotionality of love, I think, is to just get you to do it. Get you to engage with the person that's the object of your love and desire, as it were. So it is kind of difficult to study in that sense because it's something which we can't easily formulate in terms of words and therefore think about rationally. But on the other hand, there are aspects to the behavior, because this is all about close relationships and, of course, mating and eventually, as it may happen, babies and grandchildren and all these kind of things. So there are all sorts of other layers of explanation that one can look into. Why do we fall in love? What's the objective in these terms? From a biological point of view, clearly it's to facilitate the production of offspring and beyond them, hopefully grandchildren. Otherwise, if you don't have grandchildren, you don't contribute to the future gene pool of the species. So from an evolutionary point of view, it's not very interesting if nothing happens. But how we manage those relationships, what are our criteria, why do we prefer some people to other people, why do people have different preferences to the ideal person, if you like. It's a very rich and complicated social behavior, and that makes it interesting. And of course, it's something we all do.
I mean,
And how natural is monogamy from an evolutionary stance?
Monogamy in mammals is extremely rare. It occurs mainly in the dog family. So the dogs, the wolves, the jackals, the coyotes, all those species, the foxes, they are all monogamous. Every single one. Don't be confused by our modern pooches who are a bit messed up by breeding in human houses. But all their relatives, your friendly neighborhood family pet comes from, they're all monogamous. But that's very unique among the mammals and it's a consequence of the fact that being carnivores, the males are able to provision the female and indeed the young, once they're weaned, with food. So what tends to happen in all these species is the female stays with the cubs in the den, and in some species is locked into the den. The male kind of blocks the hole up and the female stays in there, and then the male goes out hunting and brings food back. And because he's not bringing leaves or fruit or something like that, because he's bringing meat, he can eat the meat and then regurgitate it. And when it comes back out at the nest, when he regurgitates at the nest, the food is half digested. So it's perfect for the cubs. And this allows sort of, if you like, cooperative breeding. But that's extremely rare in mammals, because mammals, unlike birds, mammals took this early decision to rear their babies with milk from the female. So that kind of limits what the male can do. And so most species of mammals are either promiscuous or they live in groups where males mate with several females in a harem, for example, or in a small group. Those kind of social systems are much, much more common. Humans are interesting because they kind of sit halfway between monogamous mammals and promiscuous mammals in terms of a lot of the anatomical measures of the mating system. So these two categories differ very often in terms of things like relative size of the testes, for example. Monogamous species tend to have small testes. Promiscuous species tend to have very big testicles for their body size. Humans sit absolutely in the middle. You can't decide which way they go. And I suspect that is because we've been pushed into becoming more monogamous over the last, I don't know, half million years, maybe less even, whereby probably almost certainly, like chimpanzees, the ancestral human mating system was promiscuous. But as group sizes got bigger, and this is my guess now, the problem you had was essentially lots of males in the group competing for the female. So if you build up a relationship with a female, you end up fighting lots of other males, or you risk them mating with the female. And this is probably worse from the female's point of view. So there has been the suggestion, not made by me, but by other people, that what happened is at some point when group sizes got too big and there were too many males around in the group, females started to latch on to males to provide protection. This is known as the bodyguard hypothesis. It was originally suggested by the ecologist who worked on birds, because you see a very similar kind of problem in birds when they have colonial nests. The females get harassed by too many males. So it looks like our form of monogamy, such as it is, so it's not lifelong monogamy like you have in many monkeys and apes, or in the dog family, where the pair stay together pretty much for life in most cases. It's very rare for pairs to split. In humans, this monogamy effect seems to last only for a short period of time. So this is the sort of honeymoon effect, if you like. And that's because it's based on pair bonding and driven mainly by probably female concerns and interests.
So
Most of the other species, it's the males that drive monogamy. Most of the other primates that have it. So a number of the South American monkeys are monogamous in this sense. But aside from there, the only other place where monogamy is common is the gibbons, where all the gibbon species are monogamous. But in both the South American monkeys and the gibbons, it seems to be the males that primarily maintain monogamy. So they follow the female around, if you like. Whereas it looks a little bit, at least from our data and the observations we make, on humans, it's the reverse. It's the females that follow the males and stay with them and lock onto them, and are doing it for reasons of protection.
So mainly in if you're talking strictly about humans, monogamy is not the case, let's say. Is it polygamy?
Polygamy is the most common mating system in humans. That's for absolute sure. If you count it by number of societies, monogamy only occurs where it's enforced legally by the state, basically, or by the religion. So those countries which have a long history of monogamy, so kind of Europe principally, it's largely been enforced by religion originally, and then the state backing that up. But
So
else,
is it, sorry, but is it the case that that after like society starts becoming more like secularized, monogamy starts to happen less, or not?
I don't think so. I think if you look at the history of monogamy in, say, Europe, where you've had Christianity enforcing monogamy right from very early on, well, fairly early on. I'm not sure if that goes back to the time of Jesus Christ or not, because I'm not sure what the situation with the Jews was at that time. But certainly, fairly early on within Christianity, it was enforced by religion, and then later by the state supporting the religion, if you like, certainly from medieval times. But if you look at the behavior of people, it is clear that they're not very monogamous. They keep taking lovers, or they murder their husbands or their wives to go and run off with somebody else. And not just in the nobility. If you look at the history of the nobility in Europe, they're behaving very badly. But I think this is also typical at all levels of society and in all cultures. You have this pair bonded relationship for a honeymoon period, which can last several years. Sometimes can be quite short, sometimes it can be very long, and maybe even last a lifetime. But very often, typically, it seems that it has a lifespan of this honeymoon period is a lifespan of somewhere between 5 years and 10 years. And then either people get bored with their current spouse, or temptation comes from exposure to other people, and they get
Are there any?
distracted, as they might say.
Yeah. But besides getting distracted, are there any like specific traits or indicators of tendencies of certain humans to like betray, let's say, their?
Yes, to some extent. I mean, it's clear that there are what in effect is personality differences here, because we looked at there is a very good measure of promiscuous tendency in all mammals, which is the length of the second to the fourth digit in the hand, second to the fourth finger. So the ratio of those two goes back to its origin lies in the level of testosterone that the fetus is exposed to in the womb during pregnancy, but that then seems to produce a more testosteronized offspring when it's born, which remains more testosteronized as it grows. And this applies to both sexes. It's not particular to males, but relatively speaking, you've got more and less testosteronized males and females growing up. So you end up with adults who, turns out, divide into roughly two equal camps. And we've looked at data from many different locations on this, and the split is about 50-50. You've got people who are much more promiscuous in their mating habits. Not only do we know that from their finger ratios, but we actually have data from them saying how many sexual partners they've had. And it turns out that that's sort of roughly in an evolutionary balance, that ratio. But the problem is one of frequency dependence, in effect. So, if you have two monogamous individuals who meet and become a couple, then this is kind of nirvana, right? They're both very happy in this monogamous arrangement. And I suppose if you have two individuals who are at the promiscuous end, and they do seem to be types, it's not a continuum. They divide into two separate types in the way personality often does. But two promiscuous individuals, this is another kind of nirvana, because they both say, fine, go ahead. as long as I can do the same. And those kind of form open marriages, and those open marriages have been in existence for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, thousands of years. They're not novel. The difficulties simply come when you get one of each kind, and then there is friction. Right?
Yeah, because actually, like in that case, maybe like two promiscuous persons get into a kind of polyamory nirvana, let's say.
Yeah.
Okay, so how's the typical distribution in a specific society of like promiscuous people that like this kind of relationship versus the other?
The split seems to be about 50-50 in both sexes, right? I mean, there's a tendency for males to be slightly more overall on the more promiscuous side, and women to be more on the monogamous side, but of this distribution, but the split within males and females is very close to 50-50 in two subtypes, as it were. But it does look, we did some analyses some years ago looking at the frequencies, and it did suggest that over the last few 100,000 years, during the course of our species evolution, separate from the Neanderthals and the other archaic humans, that women had been putting pressure on men to become more monogamous. That's what the data actually suggests. Their success is modest, is how, if I may say so.
How would they come to do that?
Well, in the end, any relationship is a negotiation. So, whether it's a friendship, a family relationship, a romantic relationship, it's a negotiation. The two have to come to some compromise. And so, I guess this is not necessarily a matter of big arguments in particular cases, but it may just arise as a consequence of evolutionary processes in the longer term, so that relationships where which are more monogamous are more successful as a result of that, produce more offspring and therefore have more descendants. So they gradually squeeze out the more promiscuous out of the population because they're reproducing less successfully. That's what the data actually suggest is happening. So this is not a big argument going on in the sex wars, as it used to be called. But this is just, if monogamous relationships work better and both parties are more contented as a result, then they may produce more offspring, and the investment in the offspring may be better. They're more willing to contribute to the rearing of the offspring, and as a result of that, they end up, reproducing faster than any other combination. But that can take thousands of years to come about.
What's your take on social media? It came to ruin human relationships. I feel like we are more divided than ever.
Yeah. Now, I think that's actually true, but it's a much more general case, I think. I mean, it's interesting, social media, because all our data suggests that it's a very good solution to kind of maintaining friendships, if you like, relationships, especially if you're moved away from, you move off, okay? You guys, grow up in Argentina and all your friends are there, and then you go to the US or somewhere like that, and you want to keep contact with your friends from home. It can happen, in a big country like Argentina, I suppose, the north and the south is a long way. So, you just it might also happen within a country. You move to the other side of the country, you want to keep contact with your friends. In the old days, those friendships would disappear. They would die quite naturally, just because you're not reinforcing them. So social media seem to be what we call a very good sticking plaster, right? Papers over the cracks very nicely. It's not perfect. If you don't meet up, eventually those friendships will kind of decay. I mean, you just have nice memories, but who's to say? I haven't seen this person for 20 years. Who knows what they're like now? They won't be the same person for sure. So if it's not going to stop relationships decaying eventually, but it works well for the time being. So you can see why it became very popular. But I think the problem that's emerged out of that generally, and this particularly applies to the context of romantic relationships, it just exposes you to too much choice. So there's some evidence to suggest that people who are involved a lot with the internet, either professionally or just because they spend a lot of time socially on it, if you like, they meet more people and they see all these handsome guys from Argentina and they go, wow, what a place, let's go. They become very dissatisfied with their life in the little town they live in, wherever it may be. And so, the suggestion has been made that kind of exposure to, and in some sense, there's also the problem with online dating sites. You see all these people and you see the best as well as the worst, but you remember the best. These are the things you kind of notice and gravitate to. So it then makes you very unsatisfied with your relationships now, and so destabilizes those, and is more likely, presumably, to lead to separation or divorce, or as the case may be. So there is a sense in which the internet hasn't been very good for us, partly because we're not very good at handling it. I guess we might one day learn to manage it better. The problem is we're very impressionable as a species. We're very easily impressed by what we see, pictures. And of course, you spend this long period of time, I don't know, from the age of 5 to the age of 25, learning about these processes. It's a very long learning process to develop the skills for managing social relationships. And during that time, you're exposed to all these Greek goddesses and Greek gods on the internet.
Now everyone talks about porn addiction also. It's like, to your brain, it's like a drug also, no?
Yes. And also, I mean, the problem with the kind of porn addiction side of it is it exposes you to kind of behavior, if you like, which is sort of on the extreme end of the range of behavior, and would normally be considered not acceptable behavior. And in the context of our small village that we really evolved in, and as a species have spent most of our time in, people would police much more strongly because they could see it happening. Thomas, you better behave better next time. I didn't like that way you to this other person, whether it's romantic relationships or just friendship type relationships. Stop beating that kid up. Share your toys with them. We do, parents and societies, particularly in a small village where everybody has the right to act as the policeman, and everybody accepts that.
Would you say that all of those like anonymous kind of behaviors or actions grew with the together with the magnitude of the society? Let's say, like, maybe I remember you talking about, like, at band level, maybe those things were like more controlled. By the...
No, well, I think this goes back to the fact that any social group is a trade-off between costs and benefits of living in a group permanently, right? So living with other individuals, I'm talking about mammals in general here, living with other individuals is extremely stressful in all sorts of ways, which are very disruptive, right? So you have to have mechanisms to manage those stresses and prevent them kind of overwhelming the system. Otherwise, everybody will leave. If there's too much fighting, why should you stay? Go and live with another band, or go and live on your own. It's even better. You don't have these humans to mess about with. So that general problem is there. It tends to be the explanation for why mammals in general live in quite small groups, or they live in herds, because herds allow you to come together and separate out as you wish or as circumstances dictate, and that allows you to manage these stresses. What happened in the course of primate evolution is primates and a few other species of mammals, but not many, but this is very particular for primates. Primates evolved this capacity to live in stable social groups which stay together, effectively for life. So you're born into a group and you stay in that group. And one sex may move at puberty to another group, but then it tends to stay that, stays in that group. And the problem here is that it just makes these stresses even worse. And the bigger the group, the worse the stress is. Now, these stresses come out in all sorts of places, because one of the things stress does is downgrade the immune system. So you're exposed to more diseases, you're less resistant to diseases, has a terrible effect on mammalian menstrual endocrinology. So females become infertile very quickly. And of course, you end up getting a lot of fighting going on as people are stealing each other's fruits that they've just spent an hour digging up from the ground. This nice fruit, another animal comes along and takes it. You get lots of fighting emerging out of that. And you can see this in hunter-gatherers, because the proportion of all deaths due to homicide increases very steeply and linearly in hunter-gatherer societies, modern hunter-gatherer societies. These are modern data, such that by the time your living group, the camp group, gets to 50, half of all your deaths are due to murder. And of course, that's usually because of males, right? It's the males normally responsible for this. And this, I think, explains why hunter-gatherers, although their true group size, you might say, is a much bigger grouping, the clan, which, maybe 150, 200 people in size, why that never lives together. It's always broken up and living, they occupy a big territory, but is split up into 3 or maybe 4 camp groups of somewhere between 30 and 50 typically. And that if, several groups join together at a waterhole, for example, there's some nice examples of this in the literature. If several camp groups join together at a big waterhole, because there are lots of animals to hunt there, you just end up with more fighting going on, more trouble. So that causes people to leave. So in order to live in villages, what we had to do is find ways to reduce these stress effects, to reduce the homicide data is simply the kind of top of the iceberg of what else is going on, in terms of friction and arguments.
I was wondering, because you were saying how the bigger the group, the bigger the stress, and how that stress maybe acts on something like essential as fertility. And I was wondering if, I don't know if this is true, maybe you got better data on it, but is actual human reproduction, are the levels of human reproduction lowering down right now? And if that is true, is it happening something more related to stress, or more like a social phenomena of people being more isolated and not having relationships or something like that?
Well, there are various ways the mechanism might work, and that would be perfectly okay. All we know is that fertility tends to decline in all these species, even in humans, when you get bigger groups. So fertility is lower per female in polygamous households, families, than in monogamous families. And what has become apparent in the last, 20, 30 years in the infertility clinics world is that stress is a major problem, major cause of infertilities. Until about the 1980s, the assumption was if a couple was infertile, it was because one or other, the man or the woman, is biologically not producing the right components. Either the man, did not have enough live sperm, or the woman maybe wasn't ovulating properly due to some medical condition, and that the treatment is, you decide who is the cause and you give them some treatment and everything is satisfactory. And of course, what they kind of not forgot about, but I think kind of ignored because they couldn't explain it, was that despite doing all these infertility treatments in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it didn't solve all the problems. You still had a lot of people who didn't respond to fertility treatment. And it's kind of turned out, I think, that a lot of those are simply stress effects, because after a while, these stress effects were originally shown in monkeys, and then subsequently they were shown in humans as well, that both by casual observation, so, women in very high pressure jobs, like the CEO of some big multinational, they were not able to conceive, and so they would then take time out from their job and have a slightly nicer social life at home, and suddenly they just suddenly conceive, no problem at all. Just take the pressure off, the system works. And also, there are cases where sort of pressures of just an ordinary kind. If you kind of reduce those kind of psychological pressures, the system bounces back. And we see all that going on in primates. That was all kind of being studied in the 70s and 1970s, 1980s in great detail. and then got carried across into human infertility clinics. Stress as a cause of infertility is much, much more important now in that medical context than it was then. But it's also the case that there will be lots of hidden barriers in the sense that, you may feel just slightly unhappy about the situation in the world. The world is a terrible place. All these people are doing terrible things to each other. It just makes you very unhappy. You don't want to form relationships. You might even say, I don't want to bring children into this terrible world. And that's in effect reducing the fertility too. It's just, it's a more directly psychological component. It's not a stress effect, but you're making decisions that result in your not having, I guess, what the demographers would consider to be fertile relationships. So you have no conceptions occurring because you decide, or you don't engage in sexual activity with the frequency that you would otherwise have done. You may not, that may not be psychological, it may be an unconscious decision. You're kind of unwilling to be so involved with somebody else in a relationship. So all these factors, can be triggered by these kind of social environment contexts and influence the fertility in various ways. And what most of, out with those kind of effects, the general sort of destabilizing effects that stresses have, because they make us grumpy with each other. People shout in the railway station if you try and get to the front of the queue. People shout at you. In a nice country like Argentina, they'd say, "Help yourself, do come, come to the front of the queue." But in the countryside, anyway, this would be that kind of behavior would be more civilized. In the big city, everything gets very stressed, and people shout at each other, and they end up fighting each other.
Elon Musk said that the problem with the world is going to be underpopulation and not overpopulation. Is that the case? Like we are not kids.
Well, yes. I mean, at the end of the day, of course, the problem at the moment is overpopulation. That's for sure. There are just too many of us for the planet to cope with, really. And you end up with everybody being crushed into these big urban centers, mega cities. But of course, if that causes you to stop reproducing, and most of the Western world, and the industrialized world, so Japan and so on, the birth rate is below the replacement rate. To keep the population stable, you have to produce just slightly more than 2 children. Slightly more, you have to make an allowance for children that die before they reach adulthood and can reproduce themselves. So I don't know, it's 2.1 or 2.2 children is the official replacement rate per couple. So if your birth rate is lower than that, which in most kind of European countries, Japan, probably much of the Americas, the industrialized parts of the Americas, it is, then your population will be shrinking. So how do you maintain the wealth production of the country, which is what Elon Musk will be thinking about? How do you maintain the industrial output and so on to earn the money to pay for your nice lifestyle? And the answer is it's going to be increasingly difficult. So the alternative is, you have to take migrant labor from other countries that are reproducing faster. But, that kind of solves the world crisis a little bit. But it's clear that it hasn't done very well. I mean, I can see, with where I grew up in East Africa, I think when I was a child there in the 1950s, the total population of the town was 4,000. It's now 250,000. It's crazy, absolutely insane. And I'm sure the people are not richer, for sure, because it's not an industrialized part of the world. And so there aren't the jobs for people to have. So in the end, the whole, well, I suppose what is likely in the end to happen is either the stresses in those parts of the world where the population is very, very high, the density is very high and the income is very low. Because if you have lots of people and not much money, you just end up with a lot of fighting, because everybody's stealing the money because it's the only way to have food, never mind become rich.
So you gotta have like lots of people and lots of productive people.
Yes.
At the same time.
Well, let's put it this way. Quite a lot of people and a lot of productive people is probably the answer. You don't want too many, otherwise you get back into this demographic bind again. So I think the problem with, sort of the way the world is kind of split between rich countries and poor countries. The poor countries, you'll end up with stresses and a lot of fighting and a sort of collapse of democracy and so on, and increased criminal behavior, destabilizing the societies. In the rich countries, you'll get kind of everybody less criminal behavior because there's on the whole less need for that. There's more money in jobs, but everybody's so stressed out they don't reproduce either.
So I wanted to ask maybe something along those lines, because you sparked me some ideas. Because the other day I heard something that seemed crazy, that the placebo effect was actually more effective in poorer countries than on richer countries.
Yeah, really.
It was insane. And so I wanted to know if there were like any, when it comes to love, are there any like insights or different, like really strong difference amongst different cultures, like behaviors or something? No, like what love means regarding, because you have maybe an evolutionary or biological love side, and do you have a social love side too?
I mean, nothing in human behavior, in the same way as almost nothing in primate behavior, is wholly genetically determined. Right? Everything is a mixture of genetic possibility and fine-tuning produced through learning during development. This is primarily why we have these long childhoods. Primates have these long childhoods. We have long childhoods plus the teenage years on top of that. And it's because the social world primates live in, and therefore, of course, humans especially, is so complex. It's probably the most complicated thing in the universe, right? Because it's very big. If you've got your personal social network of meaningful relationships, is around about 150 people, give or take, a little. So you're trying to deal in your mind with 150 to the power 150 relationships in your little community, to try and figure out who's friends with who this week and who's, fallen out and these kinds of things, so that you don't make mistakes. So the pathway through this minefield, social minefield, because it's very easy to make mistakes or to be too demanding of somebody and end up being attacked by all their friends, right? Which is the other thing you have to, this is why it is so complicated, because it's not just a matter of you having 150 relationships with your 150 friends and family. It's all their relationships that they have that you have to be careful of, because you have to be mindful of who will come to their support. If you upset them or behave badly to them in some way, are you going to be beaten up by their friends and their brothers and grannies and all these other people in the village, So it's a hugely, the bigger the group, the number of possible, the kind of complexity of your Excel spreadsheet that you have to maintain just increases, and it's increasing. It's the number of dimensions that's increasing, not as much as anything else. So you have this enormous spreadsheet to get it up, but also it's incredibly dynamic. From one day till the next, people's relationships are changing. And you have to be able to factor that in all the time. It adds to the complexity. So, I think this is why I say it's much more complex than the universe. Universe abides by very simple laws of physics. You can plug it into a computer and predict what's going to happen in 50 billion years' time. That's what cosmologists do, and it works. That's how they predicted background radiation. That's the remnants of the Big Bang, however many billions of years ago, 15 billion years ago. We couldn't do that. with a village, never mind a town. I mean, it's so complicated. So you have this very long learning period in which you have to practice and learn and try out different contexts. Different kinds of meet different people and see how different people behave. And it just takes a long time. The developmental psychologists now think it probably takes till about your mid-20s before you become reasonably proficient as an adult, in the sense that any of us are proficient at these skills. You don't really reach that point till about 25. And we did an neuroimaging study some years ago. It showed again that your ability to recognize facial expressions, is that a smile and they're happy, or is that a grimace and they're not happy? Right? Just from a picture of a face, to recognize the emotion early on and this was done, we did it from 8-year-olds to 80-year-olds, I think it was. So in children and teenagers, all the activities going on up at the front of the brain, they're really having to think, what is the meaning of this facial expression? From about the mid-20s, it suddenly got switched downstairs, as it were, and was automated, right? It had taken them, literally, it's taking something like 25 years of experience to fully master all the skills that are needed. As this is kind of very important. I think in that time is when you're being socialized into kind of the communal practices. So the community survives because everybody's kind of agreed with each other as to what's acceptable and what's not. You never get perfection. You'll never get 150 angels in one village. There will always be some devils, to borrow a religious metaphor.
Yeah. So,
all right. So you can't control for that. The question is, what's the maximum number of devils is acceptable without destroying the village? And your socialization process is really probably designed to try and get people to behave reasonably well most of the time, even if they're not always perfection. And therefore there are going to be cultural differences to some extent, between different cultures, which will depend on the size of the community as much as anything else. If you live in a small community, at one level you have to be much better behaved because there's nowhere to hide. Right? You can't go and rob somebody and pretend to be in a different county or something.
No, that's
not going to happen. Because everybody in a small village sees what you're doing. They know.
Yeah. That's what I wanted to ask about. That same mechanism. Can we address like something like betrayal from that standpoint in relationships? Like if the society grows, I mean, the capacity for these devils to exist and to thrive, it rises. Let's say so.
Yeah.
Does betrayal also rises with the magnitude of the society? Let's say.
That would be my guess. I mean, I don't really know if anybody's actually ever looked at that. That would be an interesting question to look at with real data. I'm not quite sure what form of data, but maybe, how many robberies from houses occur or something like that might give you this, a good view of this. But there is, I think everybody kind of feels that small communities, this is kind of our experience, of everyday experience, that if you live in a small community, in many parts of the world, even the Western world, people don't lock their doors. There's no reason to. Everybody trusts everybody else. But as the city size gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the situation gets worse and worse, and you have to, put gates on your front things and the lights and the outside of the building, all these kind of things we do to protect ourselves, and have guards and police and all these kind of things. And that is a general reflection, I think, of the fact that when you have a very large community, there are places you can hide. You're living among strangers, essentially. And people tend to be less trusting of the communities in which they live when community size gets very large. In a small community, everybody knows everybody else. They don't even need a police force, because if somebody's house is robbed, they know who did it straight away. It's always the same person. Whereas in a big anonymous city, who knows? And your risk of being attacked and killed or something is then much higher. And so I think this is a general reflection that our behavior becomes less good because there isn't the community operating as a self-policing system. In a small village community, there is old great-grandmother sitting by her fireside wagging her finger at you because you're beating up one of your cousins, and she likes both you and the cousin. So she tries to keep the peace in the village. You have, sort of a degree of respect for older people and so on that you're taught as a child, and you're never allowed to kind of lose because everybody's making sure you keep that rule. Whereas, in a big city, you might get shouted at home for being rude to your elders and betters, but when you're out down another part of the city, you can get away with it. So the whole system breaks down essentially. And again, I think this has been a problem with on networks, because if you think back to how life was, even in the developed industrialized countries, say 100 years ago, most people were living in villages, small villages, a few hundred people. And of course, in the countryside, that's still the case, sort of places even in Britain, other parts of Europe. And again, South America, okay, Buenos Aires, big place. But up in the north, there are lots of little villages, right? In those little villages, everybody's related to everybody else socially. They may also be biologically related in various ways, but socially, everybody knows everybody else. Your friends are my friends. It's just that we have slightly different relationships to them. And your mother is my auntie. But it's all part of the same network. So the network has this coherence, and also it's very much better family structured as well. Family structures are much better because they're interconnected, like a spider's web. There are many different connections. Whereas what's happened since, in the last century maybe, since the jet engine and the bicycle have appeared, but especially the jet engine, I guess, and we travel much more, what happens is our networks now consist of our family network, which is anyways much smaller than it used to be. And then that sits in one place, and then the rest of our network consists of these little groups of friends. You've got the friends you were at school with, the friends you're at college with, the friends you had on your first job when you were in the big city, friends you had on your second job when you went off to another city. And these little groups don't know each other. They don't know your family mostly. A few might, but in general, they don't know your family. So the network is no longer integrated, it's fragmented, and I think you lose the policing sense. It makes you then feel that you can get away with being badly behaved more easily because not everybody in your network knows how wicked you are, right?
And in this, it's
Your
funny.
group of friends from Buenos Aires know all about your history, right? And how badly behaved you were there. But they're a long way from where you are. So it doesn't matter.
Yeah, because I was thinking maybe like it's fun because it misbehaving becomes maybe more possible, and at the same time like these people still have like this like band level biases, let's say. So if someone behaved badly sometime, they still like go on being that person who is like to blame for everything bad that happens.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
yeah.
I was just going to say, I mean, the problem is all right, there are two kinds of people who behave badly. There are people who behave badly because they're just lazy socially and morally lazy, if you like. But there are people who behave badly because they actually can't help behaving badly. It's just their constitution. And those people very often behave like that all through their lives. Already by the age 5, they're really troublesome. And it turns out that, very often there's a genetic component to that. It's just made worse often by the circumstances in which they live. It may be a broken household or a violent household or something, just makes them worse than they already are. Those people are very poor at controlling their behavior, controlling their emotions as young children, and they never improve. Even as 40 years later, they're still very bad. And those people are much, much higher likelihood of ending up in trouble with the law, of having broken relationships, many relationships, romantic relationships that don't last very long. This is a kind of syndrome, and that's emerged out of some of these long-term studies of development where they've started, with a group of children, often very large groups of children, at the age of, sort of just after birth, and they follow them through well into adulthood. So we know that happens. And I think the problem is, what this kind of tells us is that, okay, I don't know, let's say 90% of people are reasonably well behaved. They're not all perfect, but they're acceptably well behaved. But there's about 10% maybe who are just trouble from the beginning to the end. And the difficulty here is the bigger your city or your town, the bigger your community, the bigger that 10% is going to be, or the more people that 10% is going to be. So they're going to create much more trouble. And we know that all small-scale societies live in fear of these people. Right, so not just the modern world. If you look at, we've done work on the Icelandic Vikings, for example, from medieval Vikings, but also you can see it in ethnographic studies of small-scale societies. There are just people who behave really badly all the time, and they end up very often killing others. And the community just lives in fear of these people and, tries to find solutions. Now, in the end, what happens in small-scale societies usually is everybody gets fed up to the point where a group of usually men decide to fix the problem, and they fix it permanently by killing this person. They're psychopaths. That's all there is to it.
Monkeys
They
do the
just
same.
have no sense of shame or moral feeling about, sort of beating people up and stealing their stuff and so on. So, you have a kind of solution that's a kind of in itself a violent solution, I suppose, because they just end up killing the person. Usually there's an excuse that they're bewitched, or they are bewitching, they're witches or something like that. Sometimes they might try driving them out of the group. In the Kung hunter-gatherers in southern Africa will try ostracizing somebody who, usually not a murderer, just somebody who behaves very badly and is forever shouting and swearing at everybody else and just being a nuisance. And they'll try and drive them out of the camp. And that's a kind of death penalty anyway, because you can't survive on your own as a hunter-gatherer. You have to be in a group. So you either have to go and live with somebody else and hope they haven't heard about your bad behavior and give you shelter, as it were.
Maybe sometimes we could. Does gossip play any role, like in inter groups?
Yeah, well, gossip is in the negative sense. Remember, there are two senses of the word gossip in English. There's gossiping, which you do with your friends and relations, which is just hanging out with them. That's what the word originally means, right? And then there's the more modern usage, which didn't appear until about the 1800s, of negative gossip, which is PR, advertising, or negative advertising in this particular case. And that negative advertising, to some extent, does act as a kind of policing setup. There's no question about that. Of course, the problem is, like everything in the biological world, it can be pushed too far and become very, very destructive in itself, which is the problem you see on social media with cyberbullying and stuff. But that's how the biological world is, because everything in the biological world that's good for you is bad for you if you have too much of it. Some oxygen is quite good for you. Too much oxygen can kill you. Some meat is good for you. Too much meat, you get protein poisoning. As many expeditions discovered in exploring the West in North America, the early expeditions, they didn't know what you could eat, but they could see a lot of animals. So they just animals. And several of the early expeditions died of protein poisoning because they were eating too much meat, and so on. A little salt is good for you, too much salt is bad for you. A little gossip is good for you, too much gossip is bad for you.
That's everything in its right dosage.
Yeah, yeah.
I want to turn before Hernan has another question, but I wanted to just take a little detour because I was hearing about this thing that seemed awesome to me. That was the fact that men usually went hunting not for gathering food as they were. They went hunting. Yeah. The show-off hypothesis.
Yeah.
And how it relates maybe with because I see like a relation between the show-off hypothesis and the bad boy, like in modern times, right?
Yes.
Is there a relation there?
I think so. It's about risk-taking, right? So you see this not only in, there's been arguments as to whether the show-off hypothesis works. I think it does. Very clear that it does. It still does in the modern world. We don't go hunting on the streets of Los Angeles, usually with a big rifle. So you may get into trouble if you try. But, we do other things, right? We kind of drive cars very fast and we take risks. We did a study some years ago where we found that, so this was just jaywalking, right? So there's a pedestrian crossing over a busy road. And we showed that boys were much more likely to take a risk. So if you measure the distance of the oncoming car at the time they cross the road, boys would cross when the car is much closer if there were girls watching. Girls didn't do this. Girls were more sensible, right? Boys would end up taking these risks, and it just looks like mate advertising. And essentially that's all hunting big dangerous game in Africa is, or anywhere else it becomes that. It's just that the original show-off hypothesis really came out of studying hunter-gatherers in Africa, where obviously you have some very big and dangerous game. But you also see it in Polynesia, the same kind of split. I mean, the women do not go out deep sea fishing. Okay, they may go fishing, but they do it inshore, where you can kind of wade in the pools still. Only men go out deep sea fishing out on the ocean. It's a risk-taking thing. Of course, the benefit is you come back with some enormous tuna fish or sailfin fish or something like that, which everybody goes, wow, that's really, how did you do that? But there's no question, risk-taking impresses the girls. And just go and try it. You'll see.
I mean, it's great how all these like fast cars, tattoos, and like all these cluster of phenomena are just related to this basic concept. It's insane.
Yes, I know. Yes, it's also very sad.
Yeah, it is.
That our lives are ruled by these trivial concerns.
So
it's good for the marketers, though.
Yes, I know. That this is the case. But I mean, this has always been the case. This is what I call the Mr. Darcy syndrome, right? From Jane Austen's books that are always being...
Pride and Prejudice.
Pride and Prejudice, right? So, why do all the girls... And Jane Austen was such an acute observer. Her observations of people's behavior were just phenomenal. But, the question is, why are all these girls sitting around the village hall at the village dance? They all want to marry Mr. Darcy. Well, look, he's very handsome. He's very rich. He's got a very, very big house. How did he get that big house? Well, somewhere in his family, if not him, was probably doing a lot of very shady deals of one kind or another, or taking a lot of risks and winning, because we don't see all the ones that failed, took the same risks but failed. They just disappear. And that clearly forms a very attractive criterion for mate choice. And unfortunately, in this unkind world, everybody wants to marry Mr. Darcy, and Mr. Darcy has a choice. He can marry, he has a choice to who to marry. So he picks, I don't know, a particular girl. What do the other girls do? They have to marry the curate. The curate is not even the village priest is the assistant to the priest. He's very poor, he's very ugly, he's got very boring. And this is the rest of us, we have to make the best we can do with what is on offer to us. We can't all marry Mr. Darcy. So this same principle, essentially a show off, a display in some form. It might be displaying your wealth in one context. It might be displaying your hunting skills or your prowess on the battlefield. The Cheyenne Indians, the Plains Indians in America. This is how orphans who are at the bottom of the social pile, down with the slaves, and the slaves are all sort of captives from other tribes in battle. If you were orphaned, you were right at the bottom of the social pile. You had no prospects at all. But what could happen is some of them, obviously not all, some of them bid to become war chiefs, right? And they did that by displaying prowess on the battlefield and taking oaths never to leave the battlefield alive and things like that. And I did an analysis of their mating strategies from the demographic data from the 19th century, the censuses, and they did better. They had more wives and more children than the peace chiefs, who are hereditary and didn't have to do any fighting. So this is a way out of poverty for the kids at the bottom of the hill, as it were. So in all societies, these competitive opportunities are there, and we're very attuned to them. We understand them. And we spend a lot of time looking at analysing personal ads in the days before you kind of, flick left and flick right.
Is it today, like, this phenomenon related to all the social media, like wealth display or lifestyle display with this kind of stuff? Because you see, like, all the time people not actually showing most like real lives, but more this kind of
Fictional.
fiction. It might be attractive in some way, but it just turns like boring after a while.
Really own it. Come and see.
Yeah, that's insane.
The
Yeah.
trouble with the internet is
You can show off and have nothing.
And have nothing.
Yeah.
And normally what happens, people don't. They just get sucked in.
It's insane. I love everything you're saying. It's incredible. Just maybe one last thing before we close up. I wanted to ask you a bit about the importance of kissing. Maybe if you can maybe summarize it, because it's really interesting. I've heard a lot of things about from you about that, and maybe summary it up if you want to.
I think is one of these windows of opportunity, evolution, eventually being then used as
You mean like an acceptation?
Yeah, it's exactly an acceptation.
Okay. That's great.
Wow.
We really enjoyed it. I don't know, Hernan, if you're gonna.
Yeah. It's been. Thank you very much, Robin, for sharing your ideas. It was excellent.
Great pleasure.
It's
always fun to talk about.
We should talk about lots of things: gossip, language, everything you'd like to talk. How does people get in touch with your work?
I guess the two books that might be most relevant about what we've talked about. One is my one that came out 2 years ago, which is just called Friend.
Oh, okay, it's like in
Spanish.
like Spanish. Okay, that's Spanish. Yeah. Okay, so mainly your books. You're not on social media or anything else.
I tend not to. I do lots of media stuff.
So you come to the Argentinian, to the Latin and South American world through us, then.
Yes. Although actually I have done quite a lot of interviews, newspaper familiar territory.
Okay, did you like it?
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
Okay, let's keep in touch then, Robin. It was a pleasure.
Thank you very much.